We now turn to another mountain story from Genesis chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, "Abraham, Father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for our burnt offering?"
Thanks for that reading, Hugo, and for the story, the mountain story. Thanks all of you for being here and for those who are tuning in online. This summer I've been wanting to go through some of the mountain stories in the Bible, and when I came across this one I thought, this maybe isn't the best one, I can skip it, which is probably what you would have done if your child or student or grandchild brought you a Bible and said, "Read me a story," and that's where it turned. You probably would have said, "We're going to skip this one. There are other better stories." And sometimes you might feel guilty about that. You might feel like, well, maybe I'm not as good a Christian if I'm uncomfortable with this story. But I want to give you permission to be uncomfortable with that. Sometimes we're uncomfortable with our own stories. Somebody wants to hear one of our stories, and based on the relationship, based on what we know they are sensitive about, we don't tell them all of our stories. And so there are good reasons to set Bible stories aside for different times, different audiences. And as we're going through these mountain stories, some of you have you've gone beyond your mountain climbing days. Those days are behind you. But the metaphor of the mountain continues. It's a good metaphor in the Bible. And we, in our own stories, through our lives, we have mountaintops, we have valleys, and we might attach names to those just like the names in the Bible. So here, Abraham and Isaac go up Mount Moriah. We don't know exactly where that is. There are a few hints that scholars use to kind of make connections. But this is a difficult story for us to deal with. And there are lots of times we go to the mountains and we bring enough gear. We bring our cameras. It's a beautiful day and we're ready for beauty to just smack us in the face as we're hiking. And then there are times we don't bring enough stuff. There are times where we go to the mountains and we are carrying baggage far heavier than any backpack. And that's what we're going to be thinking the whole time on the mountain. There's a movie I saw recently with Martin Sheen and Emilio Estevez, father and son. Interesting story there. But they are doing the Camino. We've talked about pilgrimages here over the years. And the story goes that the son has gone on a pilgrimage. He started the Camino, and as he's out hiking, something happens. He's up in the mountain. There's a freak storm. He gets lost. He gets overcome, and he dies in the mountains. And so the police contact his father, who's a dentist back in the States, who's always been far too busy for his son. And so the father goes out to Spain to identify his son's body. And while he's out there, he's overcome with grief and trauma. And he decides, in a way of reconnecting with his son, he's going to continue the pilgrimage. And so the movie follows him as he's doing this walk. And as he's walking, and other pilgrims have told me this, you kind of walk with the same people from day to day. Some walk a little bit slower, some faster, but you kind of build up this unintentional family almost as you're hiking. And there's a woman hiking, a younger woman, and she sees Martin Sheen's character, I forget his name, and she's a little bit cynical. Things have happened to her like everybody else, and she says, "Oh, let me guess. You're a businessman. You had to kind of shortchange your staff with their benefits, and now you're out here to get forgiveness. Is that what it is?" And he shakes his head, and she goes through more cynical, judgmental guesses. And there's other people that are walking with him that know the story, and they step forward to interrupt her to kind of validate his story, but he says, no, it's okay. So then he explains to her why he's there. It's an uncomfortable story, but he says, I have to tell this story. This is where I'm at. Sometimes we have to carry these heavy stories with us. So when we look at this story, it's hard to know how exactly we interpret this, because the message on the surface, the basic reading, the literal reading seems to be God wanted Abraham to have faith. Abraham had enough faith to sacrifice his son, so then God knew that Abraham was faithful enough. And if we want to be faithful enough, we also have to be willing to give up our children. Well, none of us would. I know our faith level, and I know the love we have for our children, and we wouldn't do that. And so then we might say, okay, well, maybe I'm just not I don't love God as much as Abraham did. I don't think that's the reading here. And I'll go into why gradually here. There are a number of rules in the Bible that explain that human sacrifice is not allowed, that God does not want, God does not love, God does not appreciate human sacrifice. And especially the sacrifice of children. The Bible makes that clear a number of times. And if you've ever had to lead a group of children through something, a trip, a class, whatever it is, you probably started with a list of rules. And then as that trip, as that school year went along, every now and then you needed to come up with new rules that you couldn't have imagined. And you don't just dream up imaginary rules about Pokemon cards and about whatever the new toys are. You didn't dream those up. Those rules came up because something happened and it became a problem. The Bible has rules against child sacrifice because from time to time, people in Israel thought they needed to do that. Now, at some level, it's understandable. Throughout human history, we've often thought we have to give up something to appease whatever God we worship so that God would bless us with rain, with gold, with military victories. And so we don't just give small things, random things, we give our best, our our most valuable, our purest. And what is better, what is more valuable, what is more pure than our children? So this is where it comes from, but of course it is ugly when you think about the inherent rights that we now assign to each other. So then what do we do with this? Well, there's another story in Judges chapter 11, another one of these that we don't read very often. We certainly don't read to our children because it's weird and uncomfortable. There's a story of a man named Jephthah. And Jephthah is a military leader, and he's out fighting a battle, and he's not sure he's going to win. So he makes a vow, a promise. He says to God, God, if you will grant me victory, then when I get home, whatever creature comes to greet me, I will sacrifice that creature to you. Well, God hears this vow, and Jephthah and his forces win. A clear victory, clearly connected to his vow as we read the story. So then Jephthah goes home, he's happy, he's celebrating his victory, and he's waiting for whatever creature it is, maybe a dog, maybe a cow, goat, whatever. As uncomfortable as even that would be, he's ready for that. But it isn't any of those that comes out to greet him. It is his daughter, his only daughter, his beloved daughter, who comes out to greet him. And then he says, what have I done? So he goes through with it. This is a weird and uncomfortable story. And the surface reading of it is strange, and none of us are ready to live out that particular surface reading. So this is how I kind of make sense of it, and I think it kind of connects with this whole story. We as theologians, as Christians, as spiritual people, when we think about these stories, we think about what these people were thinking when they wrote this story. Why did these people write this down? What were they trying to tell us? What are we supposed to learn from this writing? Then even as historians, if that's our emphasis, then we might look even farther back to the event itself. What happened? What are the forces that led to this happening? Sometimes I think it's important for us to think about the next phase. So some guy named Jephthah won a battle. He made some kind of promise. He made some kind of sacrifice. And then somebody wrote it down for some reason for people to learn things. But for thousands of years after that, people looked at that story and said, yes, we want to keep that story. We want to pass that story on to our descendants. I'm interested in that process. Because we are uncomfortable with it. Why weren't those people for thousands of years uncomfortable with it? Well, I think we can understand this story maybe better than we think. For most of human history, people have had to make difficult decisions, and some of you have had to make similar difficult decisions, where all of a sudden, the land that you're living on isn't growing crops like it used to. All of a sudden, the neighbors around you aren't as peaceful as they used to be, and you have to flee from war. All of a sudden, you have to make a quick, difficult, dangerous decision. And in order to survive that, you're going to have to make sacrifices. And so you say, okay, we might lose this crop. We might lose this. We might lose some of our soldiers if we're going to fight off our enemies. We might lose a pregnancy. We might lose some of the wealth that we've accumulated, but those are sacrifices we are willing to make for the stability that we will get by making this decision. But then what happens? We are called to make a sacrifice, but it is different than the one that we expected to make. And so this isn't just Jephthah's story specific to his child. This is all of our story as we weigh the costs of the decisions that we make. So Abraham takes his son, the son that he loves, the miraculously born son that he didn't think he would ever have. And he feels a voice from heaven that says, you need to sacrifice this son. Now, this doesn't come by itself. Abraham is we sing songs about Father Abraham. Abraham is the father of the Jews, the father of the Christians, the father of the Muslims. Abraham isn't able to rely on generations of Jewish teaching before him. Abraham is the first. Abraham doesn't get to look around and see what Jewish leaders did before him. He is the first one. And when he does look around, what does he see? He sees his neighbors regularly practicing child sacrifice because that's how you appeased gods in those days. And this isn't a creation of biblical scholars now imagining how evil the other people were. There's well-documented writings of historians for thousands of years have written this about the Carthaginians, that's the word I was looking for. The people who lived around Israel practiced child sacrifice. And so when Abraham heard this, it wasn't a strange concept. It was uncomfortable. It was tragic. It was traumatic. But it wasn't strange because this is what God's asked for. This is what religious people have to be willing to do. So Abraham was ready to do what he understood his God wanted. And so he brings Isaac to the mountain. He brings Isaac to the top of the mountain, and Isaac doesn't know what's going on, and so he asks. He says, hey, where's the animal we're going to sacrifice? And Abraham says, well, God will provide. And so he brings Isaac there. He binds Isaac. He's ready to kill Isaac for the sacrifice. But then God intervenes. Abraham was going through what he understood was needed. He hadn't heard a voice where God said, okay, that promise that I made, yeah, it'll still come true in this other way. He hadn't heard any logic around it. It's just what he had to do. But as he's about to fulfill the instruction, he hears another voice. The same voice, but this time saying no. See, last week I talked about how when the people were wandering through the wilderness, they got to Mount Sinai and they got a list of rules. They got a list of rules of how they would live their lives. But this was a breaking point. This is when they ceased to be former slaves in Egypt. This is when they started to be people of the law. These laws set them aside from other people. Some of the laws were beneficial. Some of them helped to organize their society, but many of them were rooted in their identity. You are going to be different. I, your God, am setting you apart from your neighbors. So the people of Israel would find their identity in that law. Well, in this story, Abraham isn't finding his identity, but he is finding God's identity. Because Abraham thought, okay, I have a God now. My father had a different God. My neighbors have a different God. I have my God now, and I'm going to give a tribute to my God just like all of the people around me. And then my God will bless me, and then my neighbors will somehow see that I'm blessed, even though it cost me my son, whatever. Abraham was willing to do that, understanding that his God was just like the other ones, but maybe a little bit better. But then that God intervened and said, okay, it isn't going to be like this. I am not that kind of God. I do not want what those gods want. I want what is best for you. So Abraham stopped that. He untied Isaac. Isaac went on to live a full life. The promise was fulfilled in Abraham. Abraham understood that God's identity, Yahweh's identity, was different than the gods around him. The word Moriah could mean various things, but it only appears twice in our Bibles. Here in this story in Genesis 22, but it also comes up in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 when King Solomon is going to build the temple. The temple is where people gathered to worship God, but where they also went to make sacrifices. And then for years and years after that, Jewish religious leaders would gather at this place to perform the sacrifices so that people wouldn't have to sacrifice each other, so that God could be appeased. And then on a nearby hill, there was another sacrifice. And Jesus was sacrificed for all of us. And then back on Mount Moriah, back on in the temple that Solomon built on Mount Moriah, there was a curtain that separated the holy place and the common place, and that curtain was ripped in two. We don't worship a God who requires sacrifices from us. We worship a God who is willing to make that sacrifice for us, not from us. So this is a story that is uncomfortable. It is difficult to interpret, but I think this is the message. The message is that God, our God, wasn't like the other gods. Our God drew the line, said it isn't going to be this way. You don't need to sacrifice each other. You don't need to sacrifice living creatures for me. I will make the sacrifice. I will bear the pain. I will carry the burdens of your sins to draw us closer back together. This is, I think, the story of Mount Moriah. This is the story of forgiveness and redemption that all of us need and that Jesus came to deliver. Amen.